On Thanksgiving you'll eat early and alone. And stay in your room. I don't want a scene, my daughter said. What she didn't know was that I was already planning to lock her out of my life forever. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The library has always been the jurisprudential heart of this house. Its walls are lined not with novels but with centuries of legal theory, philosophy and history. The foundational texts upon which my life and career were built. The air itself feels weighted with precedent, smelling of aging paper, leather and the faint, clean scent of beeswax polish. It is a room of profound, unassailable silence. A silence I have cultivated as both a sanctuary and a tool. It was into this chamber of quiet reason that my daughter Maya brought her chaotic, ill-conceived insurrection. She did not enter with a shout. Her methods were more modern, more insidious. She strode in with the brisk, frictionless confidence of a public relations executive about to manage a difficult client, a role she had, it seemed, assigned to me. She held a tablet in one hand, her digital scepter, and stood opposite the great mahogany desk where I had drafted some of my most significant legal opinions. She did not sit. This was not a conversation, it was a briefing. "Mother," she began, the words stripped of all warmth and refashioned into a formal title. "We need to discuss the Thanksgiving logistics." I placed the book I was reading, a first edition of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, face down on the desk, my finger marking my place. I gave her my full, undivided attention, the same focused calm I once gave to lawyers presenting their final arguments before my bench. "Langston's parents are arriving at 5. She continued, her voice a cool, polished monotone. "The senator is on a very tight schedule, so it's crucial that the evening proceeds without any friction. We need to present a unified, cohesive brand." A family, in her world, was not a unit of love, but a brand to be managed. The language was as foreign to me as if she had been speaking in tongues. Yet the meaning was brutally clear. "To that end," she said, finally getting to the point, her gaze unwavering, "I've arranged for your dinner to be served at 3 o'clock. Here, in your study. You'll eat early and alone. And then you will need to stay in this part of the house for the remainder of the evening." She paused, letting the sheer breathtaking audacity of the command settle in the silent air. I offered no reaction. My face, a mask honed by decades on the federal bench, remained a placid surface of neutral inquiry. Seeing no argument, she pressed her advantage, her voice taking on a sharper, more condescending edge. "I simply can't risk you going off script. Langston and I have a very specific narrative we need to maintain with his family. Frankly, your opinions are a variable we can't afford. I don't want a scene." The pronouncement was delivered, the verdict on my own relevance, rendered by my own child. I was not a mother, not the matriarch of this family, but an unpredictable liability, a potential public relations crisis to be quarantined. For a long, measured moment, I simply looked at her. I saw not my daughter but a stranger shaped by a world I did not recognize, a world where authenticity was a liability and narrative was king. She was a hollow vessel filled with the ambitions of her equally hollow fiancé, and she was standing in the heart of my home, attempting to evict me from my own life, one holiday at a time. Mia, misinterpreting my silence as the stunned acquiescence of a defeated old woman, gave a small, satisfied nod. Her work here was done. The client had been managed. "Good," she said briskly. "I'm glad we're on the same page." She turned and walked out, the click of her heels on the hardwood floor echoing in the vast silence. She was confident, triumphant. She believed she had finally established her authority, that she had successfully drawn the new lines of power within the family. She had no idea that she was not drawing a new map. She was merely confirming the coordinates of her own, long-planned exile. As the sound of Maya's footsteps faded, the profound silence of the library returned, but it was now charged with the lingering energy of her declaration. I did not move. I sat behind my desk, my hands resting lightly on the cool, polished wood, and allowed the full weight of the moment to be entered into the record of my mind. In my 30 years on the federal bench, I had presided over cases of immense complexity. I had untangled billion-dollar corporate disputes. I had sent unrepentant criminals to prison for life. I had passed judgment on matters of national security. I had faced down threats, intimidation, and the most exquisitely crafted legal arguments. In all that time, in all those battles of will and intellect, I had never once been rendered speechless. I had never once been dismissed. And now, in the sanctum of my own home, I had been summarily judged and sentenced to solitary confinement by my own daughter, a woman whose entire existence was a testament to the privileges my life's work had afforded her. The charge was, in essence, being myself. The sentence was exile. The justification was the avoidance of a scene. A lesser woman might have raged. She might have screamed, argued, reminded her child of who exactly had paid for the very roof under which this insult was being delivered. But rage is an emotion of the powerless. It is a chaotic, messy admission of a loss of control. I had not lost control. On the contrary, control in its most absolute form is what I was about to exercise. My reaction, therefore, was silence. It was a judicial silence, a silence that observes, that records, that allows the opposing counsel to overplay their hand and reveal the fatal weakness in their own argument. Maya had just presented her case, and in its arrogant dismissive cruelty, it was a case that condemned her utterly. She had mistaken my placid acceptance for weakness. This was a common and often fatal error made by those who faced me in court. They mistook my quiet, measured demeanor for indecision or timidity. They did not understand that by the time a case reached my courtroom, I had already spent hundreds of hours in chambers, reading every brief, every precedent, every footnote. My calm was not the absence of an opinion, it was the serene confidence of a conclusion already reached. And so it was now. Maya believed she was initiating a new chapter in the family's history, one in which she and her fiancé were the authors. She could not comprehend that she was merely acting out the final predictable scene in a narrative I had been drafting for months. She thought she was passing judgment on me. She did not realize that my judgment on her had been decided weeks ago. This final, ugly command was nothing more than a closing argument, confirming a verdict I had already reached in the quiet, deliberative chambers of my own mind. I picked up my book again, my hands steady. I looked down at the words of the Stoic emperor, a man who had understood the nature of power, duty, and betrayal. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. My revenge would not be a scene, it would not be an argument, it would be a ruling, cold, precise, legally binding, and utterly unappealable. It would be an act of justice so clean and so final that its victim would not even hear the gavel fall until the sentence had already been carried out. I nodded slowly to myself in the silent, empty room. "As you wish, Maya," I whispered to the space where she had stood. "The ayes have it. The motion is carried, so ordered." This was not, as Maya so foolishly believed, a spontaneous power play on her part, and my response was not a reaction to a single shocking insult. It was the conclusion of a long and painful trial, a case I had been privately building for over a year, ever since Langston Rhodes had entered our lives. The file on the matter was thick, a mental dossier filled with a pattern of escalating disrespect and dismissiveness that I had observed with the meticulous, detached eye of a judge reviewing a long and complex evidentiary record. The first exhibit was a dinner party. Shortly after their engagement, Langston had held court at my table, pontificating on the death of intellectualism and the rise of narrative-driven influence. He had turned to me, a man whose entire career was built on manipulating public opinion, and said, with a dismissive smirk, "With all due respect, Josephine, your generation's obsession with objective truth is a bit quaint. Today the truth is simply the story that sells." Maya had beamed at him, her eyes shining with admiration for his perceived brilliance. It was a declaration of war against the very foundation of my life's work, and my daughter had applauded it. The second exhibit was the argument over the summer house in Martha's Vineyard. It had been in our family for generations, a place of quiet, rustic tradition. Langston had declared it optically shabby and had convinced Maya that they needed to tear it down and build a modern glass and steel monstrosity more suitable for entertaining his political allies. When I had calmly refused, citing the historical and emotional significance of the home, Maya had accused me of being stuck in the past and sabotaging her future. There were dozens of smaller pieces of evidence. The way Langston would interrupt me mid-sentence to check his phone, the way Maya would translate my words to him, as if I were a foreign dignitary speaking a dead language he couldn't be bothered to understand, the suggestions that I should soften my public stances on certain legal issues, that I should avoid associating with certain old friends whose politics were no longer convenient. Each incident was a small cut, a minor transgression, but taken together they formed an undeniable pattern. They were not just thoughtless or rude, they were strategic. They were a systematic attempt to sandbag my influence, to diminish my presence, to relegate me to the role of a silent, compliant figurehead, whose only remaining function was to provide the funding and the historic legitimacy for their shallow, ambitious lives. The final clarifying moment had come 2 months ago. I had been asked to give the keynote address at a conference on constitutional law. Langston had insisted on reviewing my speech. He had returned it to me covered in red ink, with a note attached: "Too academic, needs more relatable anecdotes. Let's rebrand your message for a modern audience." The sheer unmitigated arrogance of it was breathtaking. He, a man of sound bites and spin, was attempting to edit the thoughts of a federal judge on the subject of constitutional law. That was the day I opened the case file. That was the day I made the call. My oldest and dearest friend is a man named Elias Rowe, the finest trust and estate lawyer in the country. He had been my late husband's college roommate, and he was the executor of my will. I had summoned him not to my home but to my old chambers at the federal courthouse, a place of neutral, hallowed ground. I laid out the evidence before him, not with the emotion of a wounded mother but with the cold, hard logic of a prosecutor. I detailed the pattern of behavior, the strategic diminishment, the fundamental breach of the familial contract. Elias, a man who had seen every form of human greed and betrayal, listened patiently. When I was finished, he looked at me, his eyes filled with a sad understanding. "What's your proposed remedy, Judge?" he asked softly. "The gavel," I said, giving the plan the code name that had come to me in that moment. "It's a 2-stage legal and financial protocol. Stage 1 is a complete restructuring of the Sterling Family Trust. I want to create a new, irrevocable charter with a morals clause so stringent, so rooted in the principles of integrity and respect, that Maya's recent behavior constitutes a clear and undeniable breach. Stage 2 is the execution of that clause. A full and final severance. No inheritance, no property, no access. A complete legal and financial disownment." Elias did not flinch. He simply nodded. "It's a clean constitutional kill," he said, using the grim legal parlance we both understood. "It will be airtight. But are you sure, Josephine? Once this gavel falls, it can never be undone." I looked out the window of my old chambers at the city skyline I had served for 30 years. "The legacy of this family is not a bank account, Elias," I said. "It is a tradition of principle. They have mistaken the money for the meaning. They have vandalized the tradition. There is no remedy but to remove them from the line of succession entirely. They have made their case. Now I will make my ruling." That was weeks ago. The legal framework was built. The documents drafted. All that was missing was the final formal act of provocation that would justify the sentence. Maya's Thanksgiving command was not the crime. It was merely her signing of her own, long-form confession. In the week leading up to Thanksgiving, the house was a flurry of activity. A stage being dressed for the opening night of Maya's grand performance. Florists arrived with ostentatious arrangements of out-of-season flowers. Caterers bustled in and out of the kitchen, their quiet efficiency a stark contrast to Maya's high-strung theatrical direction. She was not preparing a family meal. She was producing an event. She and Langston moved through the chaos as a single entity, their phones pressed to their ears, barking orders, managing the optics of a day that was supposed to be about gratitude. I observed it all from a serene, judicial distance. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent, watchful presence they had already dismissed. Their frantic energy was a foreign language to me. They were polishing the surface of their lives, convinced that a flawless presentation was a substitute for foundational integrity. They were fools, and their folly was a constant reaffirming echo of the rightness of my decision. While they were debating the merits of different shades of linen napkins, I was executing the final quiet motions of protocol gavel. On Monday, I had a private meeting with the director of the Sterling Foundation, the charitable organization I had founded to provide legal aid to the underserved. I signed the documents that officially transferred the bulk of my liquid assets, the vast fortune that Maya believed was her birthright, into the foundation's permanent endowment. It was no longer a personal fortune. It was a public trust, legally and irrevocably firewalled from any future claim by her or any other individual. The money was now where it had always belonged, in the service of justice, not in the funding of a PR executive's fantasy life. On Tuesday, Elias Rowe arrived, not through the front door but through the private garden entrance, as we had arranged. He brought with him the final notarized documents for the restructured Sterling Family Trust. We sat in my study, the very room designated for my impending exile, and I signed my name, my hand steady, my resolve absolute. The thick, creamy paper absorbed the ink, a final binding testament to my will. The gavel was now a loaded weapon, its legal authority unquestionable. Elias took the sealed documents with him, ready for their official delivery. On Wednesday I made 2 calls. The first was to the longtime manager of our family's country estate, a sprawling property in upstate New York that Maya had always adored. I instructed him to change the locks and the security codes effective Friday morning. The second call was to the chairman of the co-op board of the Park Avenue apartment that Maya believed she owned. I informed him that the apartment was in fact an asset of the Sterling Trust, and that the trust would be terminating the proprietary lease effective in 30 days. Each action was a quiet, invisible severing of a thread. Each signature, each call was a nail being hammered into the coffin of the life my daughter had always known. I moved through these final days with a profound and unsettling calm. There was no anger, no grief. Those emotions had been processed, deliberated upon, and dismissed weeks ago. All that remained was the quiet, solemn duty of executing a just and final sentence. I would watch Maya direct the placement of a floral centerpiece, her face a mask of concentration, and I would feel nothing but a distant clinical pity. She was so focused on the superficial details of a single evening, so blind to the tectonic, irreversible shifts happening in the very bedrock of her existence. She was the defendant, blissfully unaware that the trial had already concluded. The verdict was in, and the bailiff was walking down the hall, documents in hand, to serve the final, unappealable judgment. And she, in her infinite arrogant folly, was worried about the seating chart. Thanksgiving Day dawned cold and clear, the sky a pale, unforgiving blue. The house, scrubbed and polished to within an inch of its life, felt less like a home and more like a museum, every surface gleaming under the weight of expectation. Maya was a whirlwind of controlled, anxious energy, a general on the morning of a great battle. She was dressed in a severe but impossibly expensive cashmere dress, her hair pulled back in a tight professional chignon. She was not dressed for a family holiday, she was dressed for a hostile merger. Langston was her second in command, a slick and smiling enforcer. He patrolled the downstairs rooms, his phone in hand adjusting lighting levels and curating playlists. He was not a guest in my home, he was a stage manager, ensuring every element of the production was perfectly aligned with his intended narrative. The guests of honor, the jury for this meticulously crafted performance, arrived at precisely 5 o'clock. Senator Rhodes was a man who radiated a power so profound it seemed to bend the very air around him. He was tall, with a mane of silver hair and the easy predatory charm of a man who had never lost a fight. His wife, a woman who had chaired some of the most influential political committees in Washington, was his equal in every way, her smile a beautiful razor-sharp weapon. They were not here for a turkey dinner, they were here to assess the viability of a strategic alliance, to vet the asset their son was acquiring. Maya was transformed in their presence. Her anxiety melted away, replaced by a flawless performance of warmth and effortless grace. She was the perfect hostess, the dutiful daughter-in-law-to-be, the master of her domain. She greeted them with practiced air kisses, laughed at the senator's well-worn anecdotes, and complimented his wife on her impeccable taste. "And where is your mother?" Mrs. Rhodes asked, her sharp eyes scanning the grand foyer. "I was so looking forward to seeing Josephine again. I haven't had a decent conversation about the Supreme Court since she retired." Maya's smile did not falter for an instant. "Mother was feeling a little under the weather today," she said, her voice a silken river of compassionate concern. "She insisted we go on without her. She's resting upstairs, she sends her absolute love, of course." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly executed, that it was a work of art in its own right. It was a masterpiece of narrative control. In a single graceful stroke, she had transformed her cruel command into an act of loving care for her ailing mother, painting herself as the responsible, selfless daughter. Langston, standing beside her, placed a supportive hand on the small of her back. "Maya has been a rock," he said, his voice resonating with deep, false sincerity. "Insisted on managing everything herself, on top of making sure Josephine was comfortable. I don't know how she does it." The senator and his wife nodded, their expressions of approval a clear sign that Maya and Langston had passed their first test. They saw a strong, unified front. They saw a daughter who had her difficult, aging mother well in hand. They saw a couple who understood the importance of managing appearances. They saw a family they could do business with. Maya led them into the drawing room for cocktails, her confidence now soaring. She was in complete control. The house was hers. The narrative was hers. The future was hers. She moved through the room a queen in her court, completely and blissfully unaware that she was not a queen at all. She was the defendant in a capital trial, and the jury, charmed and impressed by her performance, had just been seated. They did not know, and she could not possibly imagine, that the verdict had already been delivered, and the executioner was scheduled to arrive before dessert. At precisely 2:55 p.m., 5 minutes before my decreed mealtime, I closed my book and rose from my chair. I walked to the window of my study, and looked out at the sprawling dormant gardens, the bare branches of the oak trees like intricate lacework against the pale sky. The house was quiet on this side, the frantic energy of the main floor, a distant muffled hum. This room, my sanctuary, had been designated as my prison. So be it. I would inhabit the role they had assigned me, not as a victim, but as a witness. My compliance was not an act of surrender. It was an act of legal and moral strategy. In the courts, a plaintiff who can demonstrate they have exhausted all other remedies, who has patiently endured the transgressions of the defendant, stands on the firmest possible ground. My quiet, dignified acceptance of this final humiliation was, in essence, my final piece of evidence, submitted to the highest court of all, my own conscience. I was demonstrating to myself and to the universe that the action I was about to take was not born of pique or anger, but of a profound, unavoidable necessity. A timid knock came at the door. It was the housekeeper, a woman who had been with our family for 30 years, her face a mask of pained embarrassment. She carried a single tray. "Ma'am," she whispered, her eyes refusing to meet mine. "Your dinner?" She placed the tray on the small table by the window. I looked at the plate. It was a sad, cursory assemblage of the feast being prepared downstairs. A few dry-looking slices of turkey, a small lumpy scoop of mashed potatoes, a dollop of cranberry sauce that had bled into a watery pool. It was an afterthought. A meal for a subordinate, for a ghost at a feast to which she was not invited. "Thank you, Maria," I said, my voice calm and even. "That will be all." She scurried out, closing the door softly behind her, grateful to be released from her role in this domestic tragedy. I sat down at the table. The plate of food before me was not sustenance. It was Exhibit A. The sheer, thoughtless cruelty of it was a perfect encapsulation of Maya's entire approach to our relationship. It was not enough to banish me. The banishment had to be accompanied by a gesture of profound, dismissive disrespect. I picked up my fork. I took a single, deliberate bite of the dry turkey. I chewed it slowly, methodically. I took a small taste of the potatoes. The food was cold. Of course it was. I was not eating a meal. I was performing a ritual. The willing enactment of my own exile. I was accepting their terms, their definition of my place in this house, in this family. I was doing so in order to demonstrate, with absolute, irrefutable clarity, that the family as I had known it, no longer existed. This single lonely plate of food was the closing statement in a long and painful trial. I ate no more. I pushed the plate away, my appetite gone, my purpose fulfilled. I had complied. I had followed the orders of the new regime. I had eaten my sad early meal. Alone in my room, I had done everything my daughter had asked of me, and in doing so I had sealed her fate. The evidence was now complete. The case file was closed. The court was ready to render its verdict. All that was left was the sentencing. Hours passed. The sun, low in the November sky, cast long distorted shadows across the library floor. The muffled sounds of the dinner party downstairs, the occasional burst of laughter, the faint clinking of glasses were a distant soundtrack to my quiet, patient vigil. I did not feel lonely. I did not feel angry. I felt a profound, almost unnerving sense of calm, the calm of a judge who has signed a final binding order and is simply waiting for it to be carried out. Sometime after the main course had been served, a soft knock came at my study door. I knew it would not be the housekeeper this time. "Come in," I said, my voice even. The door opened and Langston stood there, a glass of red wine in his hand, a look of magnanimous, self-satisfied victory on his face. He had come to survey his conquered territory, to check on the deposed queen in her tower. "Josephine," he said, his voice oozing a false, patronizing warmth. "Just wanted to make sure you were comfortable. Maya was worried about you." The lie was as effortless and reflexive as his breathing. Maya was not worried. Maya had forgotten my existence. The moment the senator had paid her a compliment. "I am perfectly comfortable, thank you, Langston," I replied, my own voice a model of polite, distant civility. I did not invite him to sit. He leaned against the doorframe, a casual, proprietary posture that set my teeth on edge. He was staking his claim, demonstrating his new elevated status in my home. "It's a great evening," he said. "The senator is in top form. We're making some real progress on the fundraising strategy for his re-election. Your daughter, by the way, is a superstar. She has them eating out of the palm of her hand." He was reporting to me as if I were a junior associate, a subordinate who needed to be kept abreast of his triumphs. He was a small man, puffed up by a small victory, completely unaware that he was standing on the precipice of a great and terrible defeat. "I'm glad to hear it," I said, my eyes not leaving the legal brief I had been reading. My disinterest was a calculated insult, a refusal to engage with his performance. He was momentarily thrown off by my lack of reaction. He had expected me to be sullen, perhaps even weeping. He had come to gloat, to witness the evidence of my capitulation. My serene academic calm was not part of his script. It was unsettling to him. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "I should get back. Just wanted to check in." He paused, then added, with a final condescending flourish, "Try not to take it too hard, Josephine. This is just how things are now. It's for the best." I finally looked up from my papers. I met his gaze directly, and for the first time I allowed a fraction of the icy judicial authority I possessed to show in my eyes. I gave him a small, polite, and utterly chilling smile. "I'm not taking anything hard, Langston," I said, my voice soft but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "I am merely finalizing some long-term arrangements, ensuring the estate is in proper order. One can't be too careful about protecting one's legacy." The words were simple, but the finality in my tone, the cold, unyielding certainty in my gaze, seemed to finally pierce his thick hide of arrogance. I saw a flicker of doubt, of genuine unease, in his eyes. This was not the defeated woman he had expected to find. This was something else entirely, something he did not understand, something that on a deep, instinctual level, he was beginning to fear. He mumbled a hasty goodbye and retreated, closing the door a little too quickly behind him. The hunter had come to admire his trapped prey, and had left with the unsettling feeling that the trap was perhaps not the one he thought it was. The dinner party downstairs reached its crescendo. I could hear the warm, confident timbre of the senator's voice as he told what was clearly a well-received story, followed by a chorus of appreciative laughter. It was the sound of power acknowledging power, of a successful alliance being forged over fine wine and roasted turkey. It was the apex of Maya and Langston's meticulously planned evening. It was the perfect dramatic moment for the verdict to be delivered. At precisely 8:15 p.m., as I knew he would, Elias Rowe had scheduled the arrival. The doorbell, a deep sonorous chime that echoed through the old house, cut through the comfortable post-dinner murmur. I heard the housekeeper's footsteps, the heavy front door opening, and then a man's voice, polite but firm, a voice that was accustomed to cutting through pretense. It was not a guest. It was not a delivery. It was the sound of official business. A moment later the dining room fell silent. It was a sudden, profound silence, the kind that happens when an unexpected and inexplicable element is introduced into a perfectly controlled environment. From my study I could not see the scene, but I could picture it perfectly in my mind's eye. The guests, their wine glasses paused halfway to their lips, their faces a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Maya and Langston, their perfect evening suddenly interrupted, their expressions of gracious hospitality freezing into masks of annoyance. And in the doorway, the courier, I had seen a photograph of him. He was a man in his 50s with a graying crew cut, and the impassive professional demeanor of a man who has served papers at weddings, funerals and boardrooms. He was not a delivery person. He was a process server, a neutral, implacable agent of the law. He walked, I knew, with a steady, unhurried pace, directly to the dining table. He would ignore the senator, he would ignore the other guests. His instructions were precise. The silence stretched. Then I heard his voice, clear and formal, cutting through the stillness. "I am looking for a Miss Maya Sterling." I could imagine Maya's reaction. The flash of irritation, the forced social laugh as she prepared to dismiss this inconvenient intrusion. "I'm Maya Sterling," she would have said. "Can I help you?" "Miss Maya Sterling," the man's voice continued, a formal, legal recitation. "You've been served." The words, so common in the legal world, so utterly alien to this setting, landed in the opulent dining room with the force of a thrown brick. Served. It was a word of lawsuits, of subpoenas, of legal trouble. It had no place here in this carefully curated bubble of power and influence. I pictured the scene, the thick legally sealed envelope, a pristine white rectangle of doom, being placed on the polished mahogany table, directly in front of my daughter's plate. The courier would have nodded once, a brief, professional gesture, and then turned and walked away. His job complete. He was the messenger, the harbinger of a judgment he neither knew nor cared about. The front door would close and he would be gone, leaving behind him a thick, suffocating silence and an envelope that contained the complete and total demolition of my daughter's world. The guests, the powerful jury Maya had so desperately sought to impress, were now the audience to a public legal execution, and the show was just beginning. For a moment no one moved. The process server was gone, but the heavy cream-colored envelope remained on the table, a stark and alien object amidst the crystal wine glasses and dessert plates. It was a bomb, and its presence had frozen the entire room in a state of suspended animation. It was Langston who broke the silence, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative with a forced, dismissive laugh. "Well, that's a new one," he said, shaking his head as if amused by the absurdity of it all. "Some sort of ridiculous publicity stunt, I'm sure. One of my political rivals, probably. They'll stop at nothing." He was trying to frame it to manage the optics, to categorize the intrusion as a bizarre but ultimately harmless prank. Maya, taking his cue, picked up the envelope, a look of theatrical annoyance on her face. "Honestly, the length some people will go to," she said, her voice a little too loud. "It's probably just a ridiculous cease and desist from some activist group." She was performing for her audience, for the senator and his wife, who were watching the scene unfold with sharp, analytical eyes. She was projecting an image of a woman unbothered, a power player accustomed to such petty attacks. With a flourish she tore open the seal. Her confident smile was still plastered on her face as she pulled out the contents. And then, the smile faltered. It did not vanish instantly, but slowly curdled, collapsing from the inside out. Her hand, which had been so steady, began to tremble. Her face, which had been flushed with the success of the evening, drained of all color, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask of disbelief. She was not holding a letter. She was holding a thick sheaf of heavy watermarked paper, bound with a blue legal ribbon. It was not the work of a prankster. It was the unmistakable, terrifyingly official product of a high-powered law firm. The room remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. The polite curiosity of the guests had sharpened into a tense, voyeuristic fascination. Langston's forced smile had vanished, replaced by a look of dawning, sickening dread. He knew, as she now knew, that this was no stunt. Maya's eyes scanned the first page, her breath catching in her throat. Her lips moved silently as she read, her mind struggling to process the cold, merciless legal jargon. In the matter of the Sterling Family Trust. Notice of immediate and irrevocable dissolution of beneficiary status. Pursuant to Article 4, Section B, regarding a fundamental breach of familial duty. Her world, which had seemed so solid, so unassailable just moments before, was beginning to fracture. The carefully constructed reality she had built for herself was dissolving into a cascade of incomprehensible legal clauses. She looked up, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost animalistic. She looked at Langston, then at his parents, her perfect audience, now the horrified witnesses to her public unraveling. She was no longer a powerful hostess in control of her domain. She was a woman in the dock, reading the charges that had been leveled against her, and realizing, with a certainty that stole the very air from her lungs, that she had already been found guilty. The public record of her life was being rewritten before her very eyes, and the author was not her. Maya fumbled through the pages, each one a fresh wave of assault against the foundations of her life. The language was cold, precise, and utterly brutal. It was the language of law, a language I had mastered and that she had never bothered to learn. It offered no room for negotiation, no space for emotional appeal. It was a machine of pure logical consequence. The first document was the formal decree from the Sterling Family Trust. It began by citing the newly ratified Morals Clause, a clause that spoke of an unbroken tradition of mutual respect, filial duty, and the preservation of the family's intellectual and moral integrity. It then went on to detail, in a series of bullet-pointed, dated entries, every major transgression Maya had committed over the past year. The dinner party where she had applauded Langston's dismissal of truth. The argument over the Vineyard House. The attempt to rebrand my keynote address. It was all there, a meticulously documented case file of her own disloyalty, The document then stated its finding that her actions constituted an egregious and systematic pattern of behavior that amounted to a fundamental breach of her duties as a beneficiary. Therefore, pursuant to the authority vested in me as the sole founding trustee, her status as a primary heir was hereby and forever terminated. The next page was even more devastating. It was a notice of termination of residency. It stated, in the driest possible terms, that the house she was currently standing in, the house she had believed was her ancestral home, was in fact, the primary asset of the Sterling Family Trust. As she was no longer a beneficiary in good standing, her right to occupy the premises was revoked. A crisp, formal sentence gave her 30 days to vacate and remove her personal belongings. A third document detailed the immediate freezing of all financial accounts linked to the trust, the credit lines that funded her extravagant lifestyle, the accounts that paid for her car, her clothes, her entire existence, all of it, terminated, effective at the moment she had been served. The river of money that had flowed to her uninterrupted since the day of her birth had been dammed, instantly and irrevocably. She was not just being disinherited from a future fortune. She was being evicted from her present. She was being rendered homeless and penniless with the stroke of a pen. Langston, seeing the utter devastation on her face, snatched the documents from her trembling hand. He began to read, his own face a mask of disbelief, rapidly hardening into pure unadulterated fury. He was not furious on Maya's behalf. He was furious on his own. He was a political strategist who had just witnessed his own political and social suicide. He had hitched his wagon to a star, only to watch it plummet from the sky in a ball of legal flame. He had not married into a dynasty. He had engaged himself to a liability, a publicly disgraced and disowned woman with no family, no home, and no money. The senator and his wife did not need to read the papers. They were experts in the subtle language of power, and they could read the entire story in the collapse of Maya's face, and the rage on their sons. They saw a deal that had gone bad, an alliance that had turned toxic. Maya finally found her voice. It was not a scream, it was a thin, ragged whisper of pure uncomprehending denial. No, she breathed, shaking her head as if to ward off the words on the page. She can't do this isn't legal, this can't be real. But she knew it was. The sheer brutal efficiency of it, the cold legal perfection of it, had her mother's fingerprints all over it. This was not the act of a wounded, emotional woman. This was the act of a federal judge, handing down a final, unassailable sentence. It was at that moment, with Maya's whispered denial still hanging in the suffocating silence of the room, that I chose to make my entrance. I did not storm in. I did not glide in with an air of triumph. I simply appeared at the grand archway of the dining room, a silent, still figure observing the wreckage I had wrought. All eyes snapped to me. The guests, Langston, his parents, and finally, Maya, her eyes, wide and swimming with tears of shock and betrayal, locked onto mine. The look on her face was one of a child who has been struck by the one person in the world they believed would always protect them. I did not speak to her. I addressed the room, my voice calm and measured, the voice of a judge taking control of her courtroom. I apologize for this unfortunate interruption to your dinner, I said, my gaze sweeping over the horrified faces of the Rhodes family. It seems a private family matter has unfortunately become a public one. Langston finally found his voice. A choked, furious sound. Josephine, what is the meaning of this? This is insane. You've humiliated us. You've humiliated your own daughter. On the contrary, Langston, I replied, my voice as cold and sharp as broken glass. Maya has humiliated herself. She has spent the better part of a year systematically attempting to dismantle the very principles upon which this family was built. This is not an act of insanity, it is an act of consequence. I took a step into the room, my gaze finally settling on my daughter. She was still holding the documents, her knuckles white. Tucked into the back of the sheaf of legal papers was one final page, a single sheet of my own personal stationery. She hadn't seen it yet. Read the last page, Maya, I said, my voice softening not with pity but with a kind of sad finality. Her trembling hands fumbled with the papers until she found it. It was a short letter written in my own hand. The script was clean, precise, and unwavering. It was not emotional. It was a legal finding, a judge's final summary to the condemned. Maya, it read, a family is not a biological fact. It is a compact built on a foundation of mutual respect, loyalty and a shared commitment to a legacy of principle. Your consistent and egregious breach of this compact has constituted a voluntary forfeiture of your standing within the legacy you were born into. You have mistaken the inheritance for the tradition. You have mistaken my love for a license to disrespect. This is not a punishment. It is a clarification of the terms you yourself have set. You have chosen to build your life on a foundation of superficiality and narrative. You are now free to do so, but you will not do it with the resources, nor under the name of a family whose deepest values you so clearly hold in contempt. She finished reading, the paper slipping from her numb fingers. She looked up at me, a silent, desperate plea in her eyes. A plea for a reversal, for a last-minute stay of execution. I gave her none. I stood there, the matriarch, the judge, the enforcer of my own laws. The judgment is final, Maya, I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. There are no appeals. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the ruins of her life, with the jury of her peers as the horrified silent witnesses to her fall from grace. The aftermath of my pronouncement was not a fiery explosion, but a swift and silent collapse, like a building whose foundations have been vaporized. The carefully constructed social and political alliance that Maya and Langston had spent a year building crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. The senator was the first to move. He was a man whose entire career was built on an instinct for survival and an unerring ability to distance himself from a losing position. He rose from his chair, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He did not look at Maya. He looked at his son, Langston, with an expression of profound, withering disappointment. "We are leaving," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. It was not a suggestion, it was a command. His wife stood in perfect silent unison. She gathered her purse, her movements precise and economical. She gave Maya a final, dismissive glance, the kind one might give to a piece of furniture that has proven to be a poor investment. The warmth and approval she had displayed all evening had vanished, replaced by an icy disdain. Langston, for his part, was in a state of shock, his strategic mind, unable to process a defeat so total and so public. He looked from his father's furious face to Maya's devastated one, and in that moment he made the only calculation a man like him could make. He chose power. He chose survival. "Maya," he began, but the words died in his throat. There was nothing to say. He had backed the wrong horse in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. He had allied himself not with a rising star, but with a disgraced, disowned and now penniless liability. He followed his parents, a dog slinking at its master's heel. He did not look back at Maya. He did not offer a word of comfort or support. Their engagement, their future, their entire shared narrative, it had all been predicated on her status, her name, her wealth. With those things gone, she was nothing to him, a failed merger, a bad investment to be written off. Maya was left alone at the head of the vast empty dining table, surrounded by the remnants of a feast that had become a funeral. The influential guests, the jury she had so desperately courted, had not just rendered a verdict, they had abandoned the courtroom, leaving her to face her sentence alone. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute. The house, which had been alive with the energy of her ambition just moments before, was now a tomb. The beautiful flower arrangements suddenly looked like funeral wreaths. The half-empty wine glasses were like relics from a forgotten civilization. She finally looked down at the legal documents scattered on the table before her. The stark black and white truth of her new reality. She was no longer Maya Sterling, heiress to a great legacy. She was just Maya, a woman with 30 days to find a new home, a new life and a new identity. The tears that finally came were not tears of rage or of sadness. They were the silent, wrenching tears of pure, uncomprehending loss. She had played a game she did not understand, against an opponent whose power she had catastrophically underestimated. She had wanted to create a scene on her own terms, to establish her own authority, and in the end she had gotten her scene, a scene of such profound and public humiliation that it would define the rest of her life. She had demanded control, and in the process had lost everything. Later that night, long after the last of the caterers had departed and the house had settled into a profound, echoing silence, I returned to my study. The lonely dinner plate from my earlier meal had been cleared away, the only evidence of my brief, symbolic exile now erased. The house felt different. It was lighter. The oppressive weight of Maya's and Langston's ambition, the constant low-grade hum of their superficiality was gone. The old house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, settling back into its own quiet. dignified rhythm. I walked to the small concealed bar behind a panel of leather-bound books and poured myself a small measure of fine, aged bourbon. From the small refrigerator I took out a single slice of the pumpkin pie the caterers had left behind. I carried my modest, solitary feast to my desk and sat down. The legal documents from the evening which the housekeeper had collected from the abandoned dining room were in a neat clinical pile to my right. I did not look at them. The matter was closed. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, the fiery, complex liquid a welcome warmth in the cool, quiet room. I took a small bite of the pie. It was rich, spiced, and perfectly made. There was no sense of triumph. There was no joy. There was only the somber, quiet satisfaction of a difficult and painful but necessary judgment having been rendered. I had amputated a part of myself to save the whole. I had sacrificed my daughter to save my legacy. It was a terrible, brutal calculus, but it was the only one that justice in its own cold and impartial way would allow. The sterling legacy was not one of money or property. It was a legacy of principle, of integrity, of an unwavering commitment to the rule of law, both in the public square and within the private walls of one's own home. Maya and the man she had chosen had declared war on those principles. They had attempted to replace a foundation of substance with a facade of optics. I had simply refused to allow it. I looked out the window at the dark, sleeping garden. I had lost a daughter tonight, but perhaps in truth, I had lost her long ago, to a world of shallow, transient values I could neither understand nor abide. This was my new Thanksgiving tradition, a quiet moment of reflection, alone in my library, with the ghosts of the past and the quiet, unyielding certainty of the future. The house was quiet, the family was smaller, but the foundation was, once again, secure. The legacy was safe. Justice in its own cold and terrible way had been served, and for the first time in a very long time, the scales of my own life felt perfectly if sorrowfully balanced. Thank you for watching.